Welcome to your nightly escape into the quieter corners of history. Tonight's tale isn't about battles or empires. It's about something colder. In medieval Italy, even ice cream had rules. And breaking them? That could land you in serious trouble. So if you're new here, and these gentle stories help you unwind, consider subscribing. Let's drift into the past together. The curious case of medieval Italian ice cream laws. Close your eyes and imagine a sun-drenched afternoon in a bustling Italian town, perhaps Palermo or Naples, in the early 1300s. The scent of fresh herbs clings to the air. A boy weaves through a narrow alleyway, carrying a clay bowl filled with something cold and lightly sweetened. He's not supposed to have it. Not now. Not in May. Technically, it's illegal. The bowl contains a chilled dessert, a kind of proto-gelato made from mountain snow, flavored with citrus zest and rosewater. And in this era, that means laws have likely been broken. Welcome to the surprisingly regulated world of medieval Italian frozen desserts. In the modern mind, ice cream feels indulgent but innocent. In 14th century Italy, it was both status symbol and municipal headache. Its production relied on labor-intensive logistics. Snow harvested from mountaintops, stored in deep stone caverns or neviere, and transported in wool-lined crates before melting into uselessness. This wasn't a treat for the masses. It was a logistical performance, a seasonal ballet of men and mules. By 1305, local governments in regions like Tuscany and Sicily began issuing rules about snow harvesting and frozen goods. Snow merchants, called niveroli, were granted tightly controlled licenses, often with monopolies over entire towns. One such license in Lucca forbade the selling of snow to unauthorized dessert makers. Another in Florence mandated that only those with ecclesiastical approval could operate snow pits near sacred springs. Why so strict? Because snow meant money. Cities realized that a well-maintained nave, snow house, was not just a luxury but a public resource. Chilled drinks, preserved fish, even surgical procedures. Snow was useful in ways that extended far beyond dessert. So when tavern owners started hoarding snow to make refreshing sorbets and selling them at triple price, the authorities began to worry. Not out of gluttony, but logistics. Imagine the scene. A sweaty magistrate in Siena, fretting over the dwindling civic snow supply while noble families sponsor elaborate feasts with chilled fruit and violet syrup slush. It all sounds rather petty, until you realize that without snow, the city hospital can't reduce fevers in plague victims. And so, out came the ordinances. In Genoa, a document from 1327 outlined limits on snow storage by private citizens. You could purchase up to 12 buckets of snow per month, unless you were part of the clergy or owned a pharmacy. Breaking this rule could cost you 10 silver denarii, a fine equal to nearly a month's wages for a journeyman baker. What was once a symbol of social grace became a battleground of municipal anxiety. The irony? Ice cream itself wasn't even quite ice cream yet. At this point in history, what we might call gelato was more a slushy mixture. Snow mixed with sweetened fruit pulp or milk curd, sometimes wine, stored in sealed vessels and rolled in straw. The consistency varied wildly. You didn't eat it with a spoon so much as sip it slowly from a shallow dish, hoping the summer heat wouldn't outpace your appetite. Still, it was coveted. There's record of one duke who instructed his steward to melt ice desserts before serving them, believing solid snow might offend the stomach. Another noble demanded his court physician inspect all cold sweets for dangerous humors. In this period of Galenic medicine, the idea of mixing hot and cold internally was seen as potentially deadly. So while towns enforced bans to preserve snow, doctors issued contradictory warnings about ingesting it. This peculiar conflict created a legal landscape filled with hilarious contradictions. In Verona, A 1318 town ordinance banned frozen infusions, taken with spoon or straw during mass hours. A bizarrely specific prohibition, thought to target young clerics sneaking sweet refreshments behind cathedral columns. Meanwhile, in Bologna, city fathers debated whether snow usage should be taxed separately when used for luxuries like weddings or dowries. What we begin to see here is the slow coalescence of food regulation, not just in terms of safety, but status. Snow wasn't just snow. It was class, access, and occasionally divine punishment. Many believed that consuming icy treats in summer could tempt fate, especially if eaten during heat waves or after fasting. And yet these laws were rarely about public health. They were, more often than not, about resource control, civic pride, and protecting local monopolies. The laws themselves read like satire. In Naples, a 1342 ordinance prohibited women from transporting frozen fruits or shaved snow across parish lines unless accompanied by a male chaperone. Officials claimed it was to reduce nefarious commerce, though most historians agree it was a poorly veiled attempt at market restriction. Still, the image of a woman fined for smuggling lemon ice across a piazza is hard to shake. Yet, through these laws, an entire profession thrived. The snow porters. These men, often migrants from mountain regions, spent their winters carving packed snow into transportable chunks, sealing them in sawdust-lined crates, and walking them down into the cities. Their hands were often frostbitten, their lungs full of cold air, but the money, at least in high summer, was respectable. One porter in Siena kept careful records of his seasonal contracts. His margins were slim, but his client list, aristocrats, abbots, and at least one famous apothecary. By the late 1300s, the laws had become increasingly arcane. In Venice, debates raged over whether imported snow from the Alps should be taxed differently than snow from local Dolomite reserves. One Venetian councilman even suggested forming a snow guild, a sort of frosty union, to standardize prices. The measure failed, but not before inspiring what some believe was the first known sorbet riot, when a sudden tax hike on summer ices led to looting of a pastry cart outside San Marco Basilica. And so, as we drift deeper into this world of seasonal scarcity, frozen economics, and fruit-flavored bylaws, you may begin to wonder, what happened when the snow ran out? The summer without snow it was bound to happen sooner or later. In a century ruled by wool-lined crates and mule caravans packed with melting treasure, the system was precarious at best. One warm winter, just one, could send the whole thing sliding downhill faster than an alpine avalanche. And so it did. The year was 1372. In central Italy, the mountain snows had been unusually light. Locals whispered of a soft winter, which sounds pleasant until you realize how deeply medieval cities depended on that cold. By early spring, neviere, those underground snow houses, were only half full. The porters, whose livelihoods depended on full quotas and packed mule trains, stood around idle. And by midsummer, the most dreaded words appeared in city ledgers and council meetings alike: shortage. Let's place ourselves in Bologna on a particularly sweltering June afternoon. The city is humming, not with bees or breezes, but with discomfort. Shirts stick to backs. Market grapes turn to vinegar on the cart. In the palazzo kitchens, servants wave fans over lemon cream, trying to simulate chill. And at the very center of this quiet culinary crisis sits a rather mundane public servant, the notary of seasonal provisions. His job, yes, this was a real role, was to monitor local supplies of goods such as oil, grain, and, in increasingly bizarre cases, snow. Normally, a paperwork-heavy role. This summer he found himself in high demand. City councilors summoned him daily for updates. Were the communal neviere holding? Could they ration snow for hospital use? And, this was whispered, never written, could the Doge still have his birthday sorbet? You might think this would prompt swift action, but this is medieval Italy, a place where bureaucracy was less like a ladder and more like an overgrown vineyard, twisting, slow, full of hidden grapes. One proposed solution was to import snow from the Apennines using overnight relays of runners. Another was to tax wine merchants extra and redirect their cellars for snow storage. A third, more radical idea involved creating a snow levy, requiring wealthier citizens to donate a portion of their private stashes to communal use. This last one did not go over well. The aristocracy, predictably, had no intention of melting their privileges. One countess wrote a furious letter to her brother in Venice, complaining that her lemon and lavender dessert had been served room temperature. She blamed those meddling snow thieves in the lower quarters. Her tone suggested something between outrage and heartbreak. And yet, the real story unfolded not in noble households, but in the taverns and apothecaries, where snow was truly vital. Tavern owners who relied on chilled drinks began substituting river stones, soaked in cold water, to give the illusion of cooling. Apothecaries, more desperate, tried storing their temperature-sensitive tinctures in damp clay pots buried in earth, praying for consistency. In the hospitals, physicians reluctantly returned to older, less effective cooling methods: vinegar cloths, shade fasting, and prayers to Saint Apollonia, patroness of fevers. The public began to notice, and when people notice a shortage, they don't write letters, they spread rumors. One especially persistent tale suggested that Sicilian pirates had hijacked several snow caravans. Another claimed that a rival town had hoarded snow under their cathedral floor. A third posited that the clergy had declared snow a sacred substance and hidden it away from commoners. None of these were true, but they didn't need to be. In a climate of heat and suspicion, truth melted faster than snow. Faced with growing unrest and some minor snow-hoarding riots, yes, really, Bologna's leaders decided to do the unthinkable: repeal the snow laws. For one summer only, they declared, a moratorium on all frozen goods regulations. No more limits on snow transport. No more taxes on chilled fruits. Citizens could buy, sell, or barter snow as they pleased. The idea was to calm the public, reassure the guilds, and, just maybe, stumble upon a better solution. It worked, sort of. Markets burst with bizarre experiments. Lukewarm sorbet, made with saltwater slush, cooled soup poured over mint leaves, and, strangely popular, frozen beans soaked in honey. Housewives set out bowls of river ice, daring nature to cooperate. Children gathered around barrels filled with chilled mud, laughing at how cold their toes became. It wasn't dignified, and it wasn't always successful, but it was inventive. And from this chaos came something quietly profound. A baker's apprentice named Aldo, working in the northern parish, discovered that cream stiffened more reliably when stirred slowly in a copper bowl over salted snow. This primitive churn method would later be recorded in his guild notebook, a modest entry that some food historians believe marks one of the first steps toward modern gelato. Meanwhile, a Franciscan friar named Luca published a curious treatise on seasonal harmony, arguing that snow shortages were divine messages urging simplicity. He advocated for warm desserts in hot months, urging his readers to digest with the sun. His book sold poorly, but his ideas were quietly adopted by monks and nuns across the region, who began creating spiced puddings and warm milk dishes as summertime fare. By late August, the worst of the heat had passed. A single unexpected blizzard in the Apennines replenished the Nevière. The porters returned. The ice carts creaked once more into cities, and yet something had changed. People had found workarounds, invented new treats, experimented with process, and in some small, silly way, the snow crisis had taught Italian cities a new rhythm, one not solely dependent on the mountains' moods. But this seasonal awakening raised a more delicate question in city councils across the region. Should they reinstate the snow laws? The laws melt. The legacy lingers. When the summer heat finally loosened its grip and autumn arrived with its softer winds, the Italian cities that had struggled, sweated, and stirred lukewarm sorbet over muddy basins were left with an uncomfortably modern question. If people found creative ways to survive the shortage, did the old laws still make sense? In the city of Bologna, where the repeal had been most radical, the council gathered that October under vaulted ceilings dim with smoke and oil fumes. They reviewed public letters, merchant tallies, even scribbled complaints from monks about the unholy warmth of August puddings. Most of all, they debated. Had freedom ruined the ice trade, or somehow improved it? Some argued passionately in favor of bringing the old laws back, perhaps with new amendments. The Physicians Guild insisted that civic snow needed protecting, especially as new fevers were cropping up and surgical procedures were expanding. One elderly porter even begged the council to restore the monopoly, claiming that the summer's anarchy had cost him half his income. But a younger faction, made up of journeymen, apprentice guilds, and even a few women traders, pushed for a more open model. They argued that the spontaneous innovation of the snowless summer had shown how adaptable the people were, how much tastier and cheaper desserts had become when free of guild interference. This back and forth went on for weeks. Eventually, a compromise emerged. Not a full restoration, but not quite full freedom either. Snow would once again be considered a public commodity during critical months, mainly for hospitals and citywide feasts, but local artisans were granted a wider license to experiment with cold recipes year-round. New types of chilled sweets, now possible thanks to trial and error during the shortage, were formally recognized by the bakers and vintners guilds. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was a start. And slowly, from this moment onward, something changed. Not just in the laws, but in the culture of cold sweets. The once tightly controlled resource became a symbol of seasonal pleasure, and no longer just a utility to be hoarded and taxed. And this shift, subtle as it was, planted the seeds for something sweeter. By the early 1400s, rudimentary recipes for semi-frozen custards began appearing in cookbooks meant for merchant families, not just nobility. A Venetian treatise from 1411 described a milk ice stirred with almond cream and jasmine, explicitly recommending it for afternoon consumption by clerks. Around the same time, Neapolitan shops began advertising Freddo infusions as daily fare, not once-a-year rarities. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Snow, once the guarded tool of apothecaries and dukes, was becoming dessert. Perhaps, even more importantly, the infrastructure surrounding snow transport was beginning to change. No longer purely the domain of mountain porters and exclusive couriers, snow delivery routes expanded to include seasonal vendors, many of whom diversified into salt, spices, or citrus during the warmer months. These small-time traders helped make chilled goods available to broader swaths of the population, especially the rising merchant class. A few historians today even consider this quiet shift one of the earliest examples of seasonal cold chain logistics in Europe. It may sound unremarkable now, but for a society used to preserving everything with smoke, vinegar, or sun, the idea of controlling cold was revolutionary. Still, the echoes of the old laws remained. Even as more families enjoyed lemon ice or almond milk frost on holy days, the snow laws never fully disappeared. They evolved, adapted, and re-emerged with new disguises: taxes on sweetened syrups, licensing for street vendors, and even, centuries later, restrictions on artificial refrigeration in certain parts of Venice during power shortages. But the spirit of that one snowless summer never quite melted. It lingered in the cracked copper churns passed down through families. It was remembered in the faded guild records that made note, always with a trace of suspicion, of new methods, For preparing chilled sweets, it breathed quietly in the soft clink of spoons against bowls in shaded courtyards, long before modern ice cream was standard. And perhaps most beautifully, it lived on in the folk songs and tavern tales that told of the year without snow, when Italians, faced with a future lacking chill, chose not panic, but pudding. So the next time you take a bite of your gelato, cold, smooth, perfectly flavored, consider the countless hands, laws, crates, mountains, and revolts it took to get there. Because once upon a time in a warm summer centuries ago, ice cream was almost outlawed forever. How Byzantine laundresses regulated soap. With imperial seals. Let your mind drift now, past the sun-bleached hills of Tuscany and the melting sorbets of medieval Italy, eastward across the Aegean Sea and into the golden heart of the Byzantine Empire. It's the 10th century. Constantinople, the gleaming capital of Byzantium, sprawls out before you. A city of mosaics and domes, incense and bureaucracy, where almost everything, even soap, is catalogued, taxed, and, quite curiously, sealed. We begin not in a palace, but beside a wash basin. The linen is rough, the water cool. It's early morning, and a group of women gather in the shaded courtyard of a laundry cooperative just behind the Forum of Constantine. Their job is not glamorous, but it is essential. They are katharistriae, Byzantine laundresses, tasked with cleansing the sweat, oil, and dirt from tunics worn by everyone from shopkeepers to senators. And their most prized possession? A palm-sized chunk of olive soap marked with a wax seal bearing the emblem of the imperial treasury. Welcome to the world of regulated cleanliness. At first glance, soap might seem like an odd item for imperial oversight. But in the Byzantine world, cleanliness had religious, social, and economic weight. Uncleanliness wasn't just undesirable, it was morally suspect. Baths were important, but so was laundry, especially as garments were expensive and often shared between generations. Soap was central to this world, and not all soap was created equal. The preferred soap of Constantinople was made with olive oil, lye from wood ash, and occasionally perfumed with herbs or resin. The best soap came from regions like Lesbos and Antioch. But it wasn't just freely traded. It was taxed, inspected, and, once within city limits, required an official wax seal to indicate purity and quality. This sealing process, recorded in fragments from imperial edicts, was overseen by minor treasury officials called sapanikarioi. Their job? To inspect soap batches, certify ingredients, and press the seal into the bars before they could be sold to approved laundries. The system wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about maintaining economic control. Soap was surprisingly expensive. A mid-sized laundry operation serving one neighborhood might go through dozens of pounds a week, and costs added up quickly. That meant laundresses had to join cooperative guilds to gain access to official sealed soap. Unauthorized soap? Confiscated. Unauthorized laundresses? Fined. In some cases even jailed. These regulations weren't just idle threats. In 927 AD, a particularly dry summer led to a shortage of olive oil across the Aegean, and the empress's personal laundresses were caught using unsealed soap made with cheaper animal fat. The scandal made its way into the treasury rolls, not because of the empress, but because her linens developed yellow streaks in the summer heat. This led to a new law. Only soap made with 70% olive oil or more could bear the imperial seal. Soap inspectors were issued portable brass testers, sort of an ancient purity scale, to weigh and sample product at city gates. This might all seem excessive, but in a society where the emperor was believed to rule with divine favor, even the faintest hint of dirt or scent of inferior lye on his robes was seen as symbolic failure. And so, the laundresses became more than just washerwomen. They were guardians of domestic order, enforcers of hygiene orthodoxy. Their work was public and essential. Interestingly, many of them were literate. Guild records show that some cooperative laundries kept written logs of soap deliveries, garment types, and even cleansing prayers used while washing priestly robes. These women handled money, filed receipts with local administrators, and occasionally testified in disputes over soap quality. One preserved court record features a laundress named Cassiane, who successfully sued a soap maker for delivering stinging blocks that damaged her client's skin. Her victory led to one of the more peculiar amendments in Byzantine soap law. All soap sold to laundresses had to be tested by being rubbed on the inspector's own forearm first. If it caused redness, it failed. This system, rigid and faintly ridiculous as it may sound, served a genuine purpose. Byzantine society placed immense trust in regulated professions, especially those dealing with purity, both physical and spiritual. The katharistrii were considered lower class, but they were also respected. Their guilds were stable, and in some cases, generational. Families passed down wash basins and copper tongs like heirlooms. In wealthier districts, laundresses became local celebrities. There are accounts of entire wedding dowries being negotiated to include long-term laundry contracts. One nobleman even insisted on hiring the soap-certified widow from St. Mama's to clean his ceremonial cloak before an audience with the emperor. But beyond the courts, the laws, and the ceremonial robes, there was daily life, gritty and mundane. A typical laundry day began before sunrise. Soap would be rationed, heated, and scraped into basins. Garments were soaked, beaten against flat stones, and then rinsed in large clay cisterns. Soap that foamed too quickly was considered suspicious. An old trick by unscrupulous dealers was to lighten soap with excess ash, making it appear strong but leaving garments scratchy. The laundresses knew better. They had their own quiet tests, the way it felt under nail, the scent left on wet wool, the sound it made when stirred in hot water. One guild manuscript even includes a poetic passage: "The soap that sings too fast lies." In time, their knowledge became so valuable that soap makers began consulting laundresses before producing new batches. Recipes were adjusted. Batches were named after favored clients. One particularly soft soap, noted for its lavender hue and long-lasting scent, was nicknamed Emperor's Elbow, supposedly the area where creases were hardest to clean. But as soap culture flourished, so too did friction. By the end of the 10th century, a new problem emerged: counterfeit seals. It began, as most Byzantine scandals did, with something small, a single bar of soap, found by accident in a back alley of Constantinople's copper district. It was misshapen and faintly sour-smelling, wrapped in cheap cloth instead of stamped with the wax seal of the imperial treasury. More curiously, it bore a crude imitation of the official Sapanikarioi emblem, a two-headed eagle with one wing crooked. The clerk who found it wasn't a soap inspector or even a member of the laundry guild. He was a lamplighter, out early, and simply tripped over it. But what followed was an investigation worthy of a palace intrigue. The forgery turned out to be part of a much larger network. Soap smugglers, an absurd phrase and yet entirely accurate, were moving batches of unsealed or falsely sealed soap through the lesser-used eastern gates of the city. These soaps, usually made with tallow or fish oil, were cheaper and lathered poorly, but they sold at half the price. And while some laundresses rejected them outright, others, especially those working outside guild protection, quietly made the switch to save costs. To the imperial treasury, this was more than a cleanliness issue. It was revenue loss, counterfeiting. A seal was no small crime. It fell under sacrilege of state property, a serious charge that shared company with treason, food adulteration, and tampering with imperial correspondence. Within weeks, new decrees flooded out of the Bukolion, the imperial administrative court. requiring random soap inspections across all neighborhoods. Laundresses, already used to bureaucracy, now had to contend with surprise visits from logothetes, state-appointed auditors who would arrive unannounced, demanding to see soap bars, usage logs, and sometimes even rub the lather between their fingers to test it. In one case, an entire cooperative was shut down for unknowingly using soap traced to a smuggled shipment from Trebizond. This crackdown, however, had an unintended consequence. It elevated the reputation of laundresses before they were seen as essential but unspectacular. Now, they were gatekeepers of legitimacy. Soap makers began hiring catharistii as product testers. One guild, the Basin of St. Theodora, even published its own booklet on recognizing true lather, which included tests for scent, heat reaction, and even lather longevity, how long the foam lasted on linen. These manuals became prized items. Soap inspectors carried them. Apothecaries copied them. One bishop even quoted from them in a sermon about moral purity. As the linen must resist the false soap, so too must the soul resist the impostor. In the back alleys and covered courtyards of Constantinople, the laundresses adapted. Most stayed loyal to the sealed soap system. It meant stability, and their reputations depended on it. But in the suburbs, where inspectors were slower to arrive, a quiet trade continued in gray market soap. These bars were often locally made by widows or traveling soap boilers, craftswomen who couldn't afford the expensive certification process. Guild records show that not all laundresses turned these women away. Some quietly supported them, choosing quality over legality. One entry, written anonymously, reads, "Better a clean tunic than a clean conscience, if the tunic keeps the boy warm." The authorities tried to maintain control. They changed the color of the wax seals every quarter: blue in spring, red in summer, green in fall, and white in winter. They added fine silver threads to the seal string, impossible to replicate without the imperial wax blend. And still, the forgeries improved. A small criminal class emerged, the sapanapai, or soap falsifiers. They operated between trade caravans and city markets, always one step ahead of the inspectors. Some were former soap makers who had lost their licenses. Others were simply clever artisans capitalizing on Byzantine bureaucracy. At least one sapanapai ring was uncovered working out of an old bathhouse near the Theodosian walls, where stolen soap was remolded and sealed using warm spoons and counterfeit dyes. The response? More laws. In 978 AD, Emperor Basil II issued an edict requiring all soap seals to be applied in the presence of both a guild witness and a treasury clerk. Any soap sold without this verification had to be destroyed. This slowed production considerably, but it also forced soap makers to align more closely with laundresses, who now became unofficial guarantors of purity. It's in this strange, slow swirl of regulation and fraud, suds and surveillance, that we begin to see something deeper. Laundresses weren't just keeping tunics clean, they were preserving a civic trust. In an empire famed for its bureaucracy, the humble act of lathering fabric with a certified bar of soap became a political act. And the women who did it, often overlooked by history, held far more power than they appeared to. They could report a corrupt seal. They could spread word of a good soap maker. They could refuse to launder a senator's robe unless it came with a verified batch. In a city obsessed with ceremony, this was no small matter. Still, with all this regulation, a question remained, quietly bubbling beneath the surface. What happened when the empire's own soap began to run out? The Byzantine Empire was a land of long memories, eternal decrees, and occasionally, very short olive harvests. The turn of the 11th century brought with it a series of unusually poor seasons along the Aegean coast. Rain fell at the wrong times. Pests chewed through precious, fruit, and gradually, without pomp or prophecy, the price of olive oil began to rise. Drastically. This was no small hiccup for a society that relied on olive oil not just for cooking and lighting, but for cleanliness. High-quality soap, the kind stamped, with imperial wax certified by soap testers and treasured by Catharistrii, was suddenly in short supply. Some producers cut their batches with animal fat. Others shut down entirely, choosing not to risk falling foul of the purity laws. And so, the laundresses of Constantinople, used to regulations, raids, and surprise audits, faced a more elemental crisis. What to do when the soap simply stopped arriving? At first they made do. They rationed their soap carefully, using it only for ceremonial garments, priestly robes, and important clients. Everyday items, market aprons, soldier tunics, common linens, were washed in simple lye water, often mixed with crushed chalk or vinegar to compensate. The results were passable but unlovely. Garments came out clean but rough. Some held on to a faint sour scent that clung through several wears. Still, the laundresses adapted. They always did. Some began foraging for traditional additives, ashes from fig trees, clay from specific riverbanks, even the juice of unripe grapes, which was rumored to break down grease. One elderly Catharistria, whose ledger miraculously survived the centuries, records using a washing mix of barley straw and vinegar steeped overnight to treat woolen robes. She called it soft fire, but ingenuity could only go so far. Soap prices continued to rise. In one merchant quarter, a single bar of sealed soap sold for more than a day's bread for a family of 5. Laundresses who had spent decades working with the sanctioned product suddenly found themselves choosing between professional ethics and basic survival. The guilds debated endlessly. Some argued to relax the seal rules temporarily, to allow unsealed soap into the market under emergency review. Others insisted that doing so would break the entire system, opening the gates once again to forgery and fraud. Meanwhile, the imperial court remained largely silent. Basil II, known more for conquest than cleanliness, was preoccupied with military campaigns in Bulgaria. And so the laundresses took matters into their own hands. Quietly, respectfully, they began to set up unofficial exchange systems, small soap, cooperatives that bypassed the treasury altogether. One cooperative near the Church of St. Polyuktos allowed members to trade soap shavings, reconstitute bars, and share verified recipes using local ingredients. Another simply pooled their remaining certified soap and rotated its use, saving the best lather for the most delicate garments. These weren't acts of rebellion, they were acts of resilience. Documents from the period show that even some treasury officials turned a blind eye. After all, they too had clothes to wash, and the laundresses, respected, resourceful, relentless, were often the only ones who still knew how to get it done right. Eventually, in the spring of 1003, the olive harvest improved. Slowly, prices dropped. The supply lines reopened, sealed. Soap began to reappear on carts and in storerooms. The empire breathed easier. The official system resumed, but things were no longer quite the same. The soap shortage had revealed something crucial. The imperial system, for all its pomp and precision, depended on the quiet intelligence of working women. Laundresses had protected the standards, preserved quality, and, even without seals, upheld the spirit of the law. When inspectors returned to full duty, they found their jobs easier. The counterfeit trade had all but vanished. Clients trusted laundresses more than ever. A few laws were revised. Soap seal inspections could now be conducted in partnership with senior laundresses. Cooperatives were granted limited authority to approve emergency batches. And in an astonishing twist of bureaucracy, the Basin of St. Theodora Guild was granted an official seat in the city's provisioning council. An unheard-of honor for a female-run organization. Their motto, carved into the meeting hall wall, said simply, "By hands clean and steady, the linen of empires endures." As for the sealed soap bars, they remained, but with a difference. Now, alongside the imperial wax, many bore a second mark, a pressed linen symbol representing the laundress guild that had verified it. It wasn't law, it wasn't enforced, but buyers paid extra for it, and in the great washing courtyards of Constantinople, where lye still steamed and basins still clinked at dawn, the Catharistrii scrubbed not just clothes, but history itself. A profession once considered menial had become essential, all through the power of soap. The Ottoman palace gardeners who were sworn to secrecy, close your eyes again and let the city of Constantinople shift before you. The Byzantine Empire is no more. The minarets now pierce the sky, and the domes shimmer beneath crescent moons. The year is 1562, and the Ottoman Empire is at its peak. Opulent, vast, meticulous. And somewhere behind the high walls of the Topkapi Palace, past tiled courtyards and perfumed halls, lies a quiet patch of greenery known only to a handful. Hasbacha-i Humayun, the Imperial Garden. It's not marked on maps. It's not spoken of outside the palace. Even inside, it is referred to only in hushed tones. The inner garden, the rose yard, the Sultan's breath. And those who work within, its leafy walls, they are not mere gardeners. They are Bostances, members of an elite corps sworn to secrecy. You might think of a gardener as someone who digs and prunes and waters. And that's true, to a point. But in the Ottoman palace, the role was different. Half horticulturist, half ceremonial guard, with a touch of bureaucratic archivist. The Bostances were responsible not only for trimming roses, but also for overseeing the symbolic and practical layout of the Sultan's private world. The Ottoman sultans believed deeply and explicitly that gardens reflected the order of the empire. Every plant, every path, every hedge was arranged to symbolize harmony, hierarchy, and divine favor. Tulips represented prosperity. Cypress trees stood for eternity, and roses, red and white, were emblems of both paradise and political control. These were not metaphorical decorations. These were living policies. Each section of the garden corresponded to a spiritual or administrative theme. The path of jasmine led to the pavilion of rest. The fountain of shadows marked the seasonal calendar. Garden layouts were designed in alignment with astronomical charts, and planting schedules followed a lunar timetable drawn up by the court astrologer. The Bostances were trained not just in plant care, but in Islamic symbolism, court etiquette, and surveillance. Most were eunuchs or former pages, deeply loyal to the palace hierarchy. They reported directly to the Bostan Chibasha, the chief gardener, who, despite the humble title, held rank equivalent to a senior admiral. Their job was clear: maintain beauty, maintain secrecy. The garden itself was ever-changing. Some seasons it bloomed with narcissus and saffron, others with hyacinth and fig. But always it was quiet. Always it was private. The only people allowed inside were the Sultan, his mother, favored concubines, and the Bostances. This secrecy was so intense that even other palace officials, viziers, scribes, even the janissaries, were forbidden entry unless summoned. Penalties for unauthorized access were severe, ranging from immediate dismissal to exile, and in at least one case, death by drowning in the Bosphorus, carried out by the Bostances themselves. Yes, these gardeners could kill, but they preferred pruning to punishment. Most of the time, their lives were slow and silent. Their routines were dictated by natural rhythms: dew at dawn, pruning at midday, harvesting rare fruits under the cover of dusk. One record describes a typical daily schedule. Before sunrise, watering fig and pomegranate trees with moon-warmed water stored in clay jugs. Mid-morning, recording the state of each plant in the garden book using poetic descriptions. Noon, quiet, prayers at the cedar shrine, followed by trimming rose branches with gold-handled shears. Late afternoon, carrying fresh-cut flowers in silk-lined baskets to the harem. Evening, standing guard while the Sultan walked among the myrtles. They wore simple tunics, but always with a sash of red and green, the colors of divine renewal and loyalty. And they spoke little. Talking in the garden was discouraged unless absolutely necessary. One Bostansha manual includes the phrase, "Words bend the branches of silence." Strangely, their silence didn't mean isolation. The Bostanses were trusted advisors when it came to subtle palace politics. A poorly maintained garden was considered a sign of imperial weakness. The wilting of a specific flower might be taken as an omen. One sultan reportedly postponed a military campaign after a night-blooming cereus failed to open on the expected date. Historians debate whether the gardeners truly believed in these signs or whether they quietly used them to nudge policy in one direction or another. And while the Sultan's word was law, the garden sometimes whispered something different. There were secrets, of course. The Bostanses knew which concubine walked where. They overheard private conversations in rose-perfumed alcoves. They witnessed the Sultan weeping beneath the cypress trees after a political betrayal. None of this was recorded, but some was hinted at, in the choice of flowers sent to council, chambers in the arrangement of lilies at banquets, in the silent refusal to let a certain path be swept clean. These were quiet protests, gentle nudges, the empire's heartbeat, expressed in leaves. But not all was calm, because one year, the garden was shut entirely. No one entered. No flowers were delivered. The Bostanses disappeared from view. What had happened inside the garden's walls that made even the Sultan retreat? The year was 1574. The month, September. And in the heart of Topkapi Palace, the Hazbacha-i Humayun, the imperial inner garden, was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, not peaceful, not serene, just absent. No roses lined the walkways. No baskets of tulips were carried to the harem. The fountains had stopped trickling. Even the myrtle paths, once swept thrice daily, now lay scattered with fallen leaves. The silence was no longer symbolic. It was literal. The garden, usually so vital to the rhythm of palace life, had become a blank space. At first, no one spoke of it. Then, inevitably, the whispers began. Some said the chief gardener, the Bostanchi Basha, had died suddenly of poison. Others claimed a rare disease had struck the fig trees, causing the Sultan to declare the garden unclean. One bold janissary speculated that a concubine had tried to escape through the rose maze and was caught, triggering a lockdown. But there were no public announcements. Only the absence remained. It wasn't just the plants that vanished. It was the men. The Bostanses, once seen tending herbs or arranging pomegranates for courtly feasts, no longer appeared. Their chambers were sealed, their tools removed. The path from the privy chamber to the garden was blocked by a single velvet rope, unlabeled, unmanned. It was as though the entire garden had been erased from palace memory overnight. But why? To answer that, we must turn to a name you won't find in most imperial records. Murad, son of Selim II. The young prince had been raised in Topkapi under close supervision, educated in the classics, steeped in Quranic law, and frequently walked among the garden paths as a child. It was said that Murad preferred cypress to conversation, and that the Bostanses were the only staff allowed to speak to him directly, always in whispers. In his 12th year, Murad began planting a section of the garden himself. He chose rare, Persian narcissus and a climbing rose called Mavi Guz, Blue Eye. His tutor, an elderly Sufi, insisted the act of planting one's own flowers would tie your heart to humility. Murad believed this deeply. He returned to that patch every spring. But when Murad's father, Selim II, died in 1574 after a fall in his bathhouse, everything changed. Murad was now Sultan Murad III. The transition was smooth in public, but turbulent within. Murad inherited not just the throne, but also a court full of rival factions, viziers, eunuchs, generals, each with their own expectations. He withdrew more and more into the palace. The garden, once his sanctuary, became off-limits. No formal decree, no edict, just a sudden, unspoken retreat. The Bostances received word to halt all pruning. No deliveries, no access. The chief gardener was reassigned to the outer gardens of Dolmabahce. The inner garden's gates were locked. At the same time, strange reports surfaced. A concubine in the harem claimed to hear footsteps at night near the fig trees, despite the garden being sealed. A court servant swore he saw lights flickering by the rose fountain just before dawn. And one clerk, tasked with cleaning the Sultan's personal prayer rug, found a single tulip petal pressed into its folds, though no tulips had been harvested in weeks. None of these were confirmed, but they fueled speculation. The most persistent rumor was this: Murad had seen something in the garden, whether in a dream or while walking alone at night or through the misted reflection of the fountain's surface. No one knew, but whatever it was, it unsettled him deeply. One chronicler, writing in the margins of a court ledger, noted only this: the roses did not bloom this year, and His Majesty did not smile. It would be easy to dismiss such stories as palace gossip. But in the Ottoman world, gardens were more than decoration. They were cosmic mirrors. The symmetry of their design, the sequence of their blooms, the arrangement of water and earth. These were believed to reflect the state of the Sultan's soul, and by extension, the empire. A withered rose was never just a withered rose. Months passed. The garden remained closed. The Bostances, now stationed elsewhere, began to worry. Some feared their sacred garden would be repurposed. Others believed it would be torn up and rebuilt under a new astrologer's design. But still, no orders came. It was as though the garden existed in suspension, a breathing thing, held captive by something unspoken. Then, in March of 1575, during an early thaw, something unexpected occurred. A single Bostansu, an older man, named Yaqub, received a sealed note bearing the Sultan's personal signet. It instructed him to enter the garden alone at dawn and perform a full inspection. No explanation, no escort, just a key. Yaqub, whose hands had not touched rosewood shears in 6 months, obeyed. What he found he would later describe as neither ruin nor rot, but pause. The garden was intact. Overgrown, yes. Weeds had crept in. Vines sagged. Some fountains had dried. But nothing was broken. Nothing vandalized. The garden had simply waited. Yaqub trimmed the outer paths, removed dead branches, and reported back. 3 days later, the Sultan summoned him, not to speak, but to walk. The two men strolled the inner garden in silence for nearly 2 hours. At the end, Murad said, only, "Let it begin again." And so slowly, the garden returned. But it was different now. The Sultan did not allow the full core of Bostances to return, only a select few. A new planting order was issued. No cypress trees, no night blooming, cereus. The Mavi Gauze roses were removed. In their place, Murad ordered a field of saffron crocuses, a flower associated with forgetfulness, renewal, and the soft dimming of memory. Some say this was symbolic. Others say it was medicinal. For Murad, increasingly withdrawn in the years to come, the garden became both mirror and mask. He visited it more often than he did his advisors. He wandered its paths at night and sat by the fountain of shadows well past midnight. The garden flourished, but only in certain shapes, certain shades. The Bostances resumed their duties with reverence. They spoke less than ever. Some recorded changes in their own personal ledgers, noting which paths the Sultan avoided, which flowers he lingered by, and which he had removed altogether. And though the gates were reopened, something had changed. Forever. The garden no longer welcomed others. Deliveries resumed. Yes, ceremonial roses were cut and presented at feasts. But few, if any, courtiers were permitted to walk within. It became a private world, visible from afar, unreachable up close. Years later, as Murad's reign entered its twilight, the garden remained quiet, not in silence, but in stillness, a peace both heavy and deliberate. Historians today debate what truly happened in that lost year. Some point to political pressure, others to personal grief, a few to visions or divine warnings, but none can say for sure. All we know is this: for one long season, the most carefully curated garden in the empire stopped blooming. And when it returned, it was no longer just a place of beauty. It had become a space of memory, a mirror the Sultan looked into and never quite out of. By the final decade of the 16th century, the Hasbacha-i Humayun, once a radiant crown within the Topkapi Palace, had settled into something quieter, softer, not less beautiful, but different. Its edges were less precise, its colors more subdued. It no longer performed the empire's grandeur. Instead, it hummed the Sultan's introspection. Sultan Murad III, now well into his later years, rarely left the palace. His court grew wary of his solitude. Some blamed the astrologers who had warned against travel. Others whispered of illness, melancholia, or secret grief. But for those who still served within the palace walls, the clearest truth was this: the Sultan had become a man of routine, and that routine lived inside the garden. Every morning at dawn, he walked the eastern path, alone but for one Bostansu, the same Yaqub who had been summoned during the garden's closure. Every evening before prayer, Murad sat on the cedar bench overlooking the crocus beds. He no longer spoke to his concubines about tulips. He no longer ordered roses for court festivals. But he noticed everything. If a vine tangled, he mentioned it. If a fountain lost its song, he gestured silently. The Bostances responded without question. They had adapted too. The reformed garden corps was smaller, more monastic. They kept no formal records, only oral instructions passed quietly from elder to apprentice. Each man knew his area: the path of jasmine, the tunnel of fig, the shadowed reflecting pool. Tools were polished nightly. Water was drawn by hand from the original cisterns. Nothing mechanical touched the soil. It was said that a single misplaced petal could delay the Sultan's entrance by hours. One year, a foreign ambassador from Venice requested a tour of the famous garden. The request was politely declined. Another time, a French physician wrote a treatise claiming certain plants within the Sultan's garden had curative properties, especially saffron. The manuscript was banned in Istanbul. Garden knowledge, once a source of empire-wide pride, had become something else: private, protective, sacred. Still, time moved forward, as it always does. The Sultan aged. The garden aged with him. Trees thickened, flowers changed. The crocus field, once vivid and golden, dulled each year into paler blooms. Whether the bulbs were failing or the soil simply weary, no one knew. Yaqub, now gray and slower of step, noted it, but said nothing. But others noticed. The Sultan most of all. He began walking earlier in the mornings, sitting longer in the evenings. Sometimes his attendants found him asleep beneath the arbor, head bowed beneath the jasmine. The garden, it seemed, had become his final confidant. One cold morning in December of 1595, Murad did not walk the path. A page found him in his chamber, peaceful. His prayer beads looped twice around his wrist. His death was quiet, without spectacle. The court moved quickly. His son, Mehmed III, ascended to the throne. The garden paused. There was no official mourning inside the Hazbacha, no public flowers, no ceremonial pruning. The Bostances, as was tradition, wore their sashes in reverse color, green on red. For 3 days they tended no plants. They sat in silence along the garden's perimeter, each at his usual post. When asked why, Yaqub replied, "He is still walking." Mehmed, unlike his father, was less attached to the garden. He preferred the ceremonial courtyards, the hunting lodges, the halls of mirrors. He allowed the garden to remain but reduced its funding. The crocus field was never replanted. The jasmine tunnel was trimmed but no longer perfumed. The cedar bench was removed for repairs and never returned. By 1600, only 3 Bostances remained assigned to the inner garden, and yet it lived, not in grandeur, but in memory. The soil still breathed. The myrtle hedges still curled gently along the old walks. The fountain of shadows still burbled faintly, though fewer birds visited it. And deep within the garden walls, beneath a circle of pear trees, a small plaque was placed, simple, unadorned, written in classical Ottoman Turkish. It read, "To the one who heard the garden's silence, few saw it. Fewer still understood it, but the Bostanches kept it clean." In later years, as Topkapi gave way to newer palaces, Dolmabahce, Yıldız, the garden was visited less and less. Eventually, it was locked entirely, declared a historical enclosure. Botanists occasionally surveyed it. Artists painted it from memory. But the original garden, the private world of Sultan Murad III and his silent guardians, was never restored. It did not need to be, because its legacy lived not in roses or fountains, but in the idea that a garden could listen, that a place of ordered greenery and choreographed silence could hold a man's fears, joys, regrets, and solitude without ever repeating them. And that a handful of loyal gardeners, half mystics, half sentinels, could protect that silence with shears and sandals, with discipline and dew. Today, when visitors walk the outer gardens of Topkapi, they often peer toward the locked iron gate near the eastern wing. They see nothing beyond it, just overgrowth and stone. Most pass it by, but those who know, those who've read the footnotes and whispered records, pause a little longer. They imagine the crocus beds, the jasmine tunnel, the man in robes, walking barefoot among vines. And if the wind is right, they might even catch the scent of old saffron and the soft memory of footsteps on stone. France, 1696, Louis XIII sits on the throne, resplendent, absolute, and increasingly expensive. His reign, the longest of any monarch in European history, is already heavy with spectacle. Golden halls, standing armies, and a palace at Versailles that drinks up silver like a thirsty king at a summer banquet. France is grand, France is mighty, France is broke. War has drained the treasury. Building projects continue endlessly. The Sun King's image must be maintained at any cost, and so his ministers, scribes, and tax officials, those unsung engineers of national discomfort, begin to draft new ways to squeeze revenue from the nation. And one bureaucrat, somewhere in the parchment-wrapped quiet of the Bureau of Revenue, points out the obvious. Every house has windows. It is a deceptively simple observation. Windows are everywhere. They let in light. They reveal status. They, crucially, cannot be hidden without consequence. And so begins one of the oddest, most quietly intrusive chapters in French tax history. The window tax. The logic is as old as governance. Tax what's visible. Just as chimneys had been taxed in England and hearths in the Holy Roman Empire, windows offered a perfect opportunity to charge citizens for the privilege of air and sunlight. But this was France, and nothing was ever as straightforward as it seemed. The tax was based on the number of exterior windows in a home, with exemptions for peasant cottages and dwellings with fewer than a set number, initially 5. More than that, and you owed the crown a modest fee per window per year. It seemed fair. After all, who needed 10 windows? Aristocrats, merchants, city dwellers, and pretty much everyone else who didn't want to live in the dark. At first, enforcement was straightforward. Inspectors, commissaires de fenêtres, were dispatched to towns and cities to count windows. They were trained in basic architectural recognition and issued clipboards, wax seals, and sashes identifying them as royal agents. Many wore brown coats and kept small folding stools to sit and sketch facades. The towns did not take it well. In Bordeaux, several inspectors were pelted with cabbage. In Rouen, a baker nailed his shutters closed and claimed divine exemption. In rural villages, tax collectors were often greeted with mysteriously empty facades, whole hamlets that overnight appeared to have gone blind. It turned out that windows were surprisingly easy to fake or unmake. Landowners began bricking up openings before inspections. Some filled windows with plaster and painted fake frames to maintain aesthetic symmetry. Others installed wooden panels designed to be removed after the inspector passed. A few hired local children to stand in front of window groups and block the view, feigning innocence. The inspectors, for their part, adapted. Some counted shadows to estimate unseen windows. Others bribed neighbors or scaled low walls. In one case, an inspector used a mirror across a street to spot an unregistered upper pane. Still, the cat-and-mouse game persisted. Then came the ledgers. Every town, every street, every property was to be entered into a royal register. Facades were sketched. Window counts were recorded. Owners were notified. But here the system began to unravel, not because of resistance, but because of volume. France had windows. Too many. Tens of thousands of properties. Thousands of towns. Countless exceptions and unique structures. Some houses had fake windows for balance. Others shared window frames between units. Some had windows that were also doors, porte-fenêtres, and sparked heated debates in the bureau. Were they taxed once? Twice? Only when opened? The bureaucracy began to bloat. Forms expanded. Columns multiplied. Margins filled with angry notes and doodles of offending windows. At one point, an assistant to the Minister of Finance reportedly burst into tears after failing to categorize a turret with 6 oval windows and a stained glass transom. But beyond the palace halls, something subtler was happening. Cities began to change. Architects, eager to avoid fees for their clients, adapted. Houses were built taller but narrower, with fewer exterior panes. Internal courtyards flourished, places where light could reach without facing the street. Slatted windows and glass bricks gained popularity. In some towns, the wealthiest families had the fewest visible windows. A strange paradox emerged. In the Age of Enlightenment, people were hiding from the light. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens suffered. Poor families with older homes couldn't afford to brick up windows. Others, in need of ventilation, kept theirs open and paid the price. The tax, initially aimed at the upper classes, trickled downward. Small shopkeepers, widows, schoolmasters, all began seeing fees pile up. Some fell into arrears. Others chose between bread and brightness. In response, local satirists pounced. Pamphlets were circulated mocking the government. Tax the clouds, tax the birds, tax the moonlight while you're at it. One Parisian artist painted a mock inspection scene with the title, "The Kingdom of Shade." A popular tavern song included the verse, "If you must live in darkness, do so near the king. He'll never be taxed." This wasn't entirely untrue. Royal residences were, of course, exempt, so were many properties belonging to clergy or state officials. Versailles alone had hundreds of windows, none of which paid a sou. The hypocrisy was noted. It was just another pane of inequity in a wall of growing resentment. Yet remarkably, the tax persisted. Because despite its flaws, it worked, revenue flowed. The kingdom survived, wars continued. And for the bureaucrats, the ledgers became a kind of scripture. Some inspectors developed personal relationships with certain buildings. One noted in his journal that the hunchbacked house on Rue du Moulin has never lied to me. 7 windows, honest and dusty. But honesty was the exception. And by 1710, nearly 15 years into the tax's life, the record system began to collapse under its own weight. Window counts contradicted earlier counts. Properties changed hands. Maps were out of date. Inspectors disagreed. Some bribed, some quit. A fire in a provincial tax office destroyed 6 years' worth of window logs. The government responded, predictably, with more bureaucracy. A new form was issued, then another. A fresh survey was commissioned, and a centralized Bureau de Clarté was formed to reconcile inconsistencies. Its work would never be finished. And all the while, the windows of France continued to open, close, vanish, and return. Always slightly, out of sync with the government's gaze. By now, you may be wondering, what happened to all the windows that disappeared? The missing windows of France became something of a national riddle by the early 18th century. To the crown, they were figures, lines left blank on parchment scrolls, fees unpaid, losses projected. To tax inspectors, they were headaches with hinges, a second-floor casement marked on the last visit, now mysteriously gone. And to the people of France, they were symbols, frustrating, farcical, sometimes sacred. In truth, most of the windows hadn't vanished. They'd simply been hidden, behind brick, behind wood, behind shutters nailed shut and painted over with fake depth and decorative trim. Entire neighborhoods began to develop visual quirks. Houses with perfectly symmetrical facades except for one blank square. Alleys filled with walls that echoed with sound but betrayed no glass. Window blindness had become an architectural strategy. And yet, tax inspectors persisted. The Bureau de Clarté, the newly centralized office meant to bring order to the chaos, began an ambitious campaign of window reconciliation. This involved cross-referencing historical ledgers with building plans, citizen testimony, and even artists' sketches from prior decades. They called it La Révision Lumineuse, the luminous audit. It was, from the start, a doomed endeavor. The French state was ill-equipped to track the evolution of every home, every wall, every clever workaround. And homeowners, increasingly inventive, stayed a step ahead. In the port city of Marseille, a group of artisans engineered a rotating shutter panel that could open from the inside, but appeared sealed from the outside. In Lyon, a painter offered services to disguise closed windows as murals of open ones, an optical illusion that confused both inspectors and pigeons. In some towns, inspectors grew so frustrated they simply gave up. Others took matters into their own hands. One inspector in Avignon began marking buildings with chalk symbols after each survey, a secret code only he understood, denoting suspected bricked windows, disputed taxes, and compliant but suspicious families. Another, working along the Seine, carried a collapsible ladder to peek behind shutters, though he was chased away more than once by angry bakers and broom-wielding widows. The window tax had become a battleground, not only of finance, but of interpretation. Citizens questioned what counted as a window. Was a round opening taxable? What about a slit near the roof? A barn door with a glass inset? Did a window in a stairwell count if it wasn't in a living space? These arguments played out in dusty tax offices across the country, often with such intensity that officials joked about issuing moral clarity instead of window clarity. But underneath the laughter, the burden remained. Poorer families who couldn't afford to modify their homes were still paying. In tightly packed towns, families simply curtained off inner rooms, living in partial dark to avoid the annual fee. In some rural districts, churches began hosting light vigils, advocating for the right to let daylight into homes without cost. The clergy's involvement was, as always, a blend of genuine concern and political leverage. It was around this time that a new figure emerged: the comptable des ombres, the shadow accountant, a former surveyor turned semi-outsider. This man, real name long forgotten, began publishing anonymous broadsheets analyzing the tax's philosophical absurdities. His most famous pamphlet, Le Soleil Taxé, questioned how a nation could charge its citizens for the passage of light. One passage read, "Shall we next measure the air through nostrils, the warmth in our blankets, the noise that travels from the chapel bell to our ears? If light, then all, and if all, then none are free." The pamphlet spread quickly. Though banned by the state, copies were recited in taverns, scribbled in margins, and printed in code beneath advertisements for soap or wine. The comptable had struck a nerve, not just with his poetry, but with his practicality. Because while aristocrats continued to dine by lantern glow in halls with dozens of untaxed windows, city tailors were now being fined for sunlight falling onto their thread. Meanwhile, the Bureau de Clarté grew ever more tangled. Their ledgers ballooned. Corrections turned into corrections of corrections. The department eventually introduced a window revision token program, allowing citizens to prepay for window audits in the hopes of clearing disputes. The tokens, small bronze discs embossed with a starburst, were meant to inspire trust. They were also used as coasters, or melted down for buttons. And still the windows kept misbehaving. In one case from Orléans, a tavern owner sued the Bureau for taxing a reflection, light entering his neighbor's upper floor window, bouncing off, a polished copper awning, and illuminating his dining room. The Bureau lost, but the inspector involved resigned in protest and left a note reading, "I have seen light taxed twice. What more can man endure?" Yet, for all its nonsense, the tax endured, because it brought money, and because repeal, though whispered in council halls, was always politically unwise. To cancel the tax would be to admit the absurdity. To admit absurdity was to open the floodgates to revolt, which, as it happened, would come soon enough. But even before revolution, the tax had shaped France in quieter ways. You can still see it today, in the oddly blank walls of 18th century buildings, in the tall, narrow townhouses with shuttered upper stories, in the ghost outlines of bricked-up windows, symmetrical impressions on plaster where light once entered freely. Architecture became shadowed by policy. The rhythm of homes changed. Gardens were moved inward. Families gathered near the hearth, not just for warmth, but for untaxed brightness. And in the dark corners of city apartments, children played games of light and shadow, learning early that daylight was not free. It's easy to laugh at it now, to joke about taxing sunsets or air. But the window tax wasn't just a bureaucratic blunder. It was a reminder that even the most basic comforts, light, air, openness, can be subject to the ledger, and that once the state puts its eye to your wall, even a pane of glass becomes a point of contention. But the real question the tax never answered was this: how do you keep track of something that's always disappearing into light? By the 1760s, the French window tax had reached its final exhausted phase. The ledgers were bloated, the inspectors demoralized, and the buildings of France stood as quiet monuments to bureaucratic overreach. The walls told the story best. In cities like Reims, Dijon, and Avignon, facades bore the ghostly outlines of bricked-over windows, some clumsy and obvious, others cunningly disguised. Some streets seemed as though they had blinked, one eye at a time, until finally going blind. And yet the sunlight still found a way in. In Paris, architects developed light wells, narrow shafts carved into buildings that let daylight fall from above. In Montpellier, translucent rooftop tiles began appearing on merchant homes. The tax code hadn't mentioned skylights. Not yet. In Bordeaux, one entire neighborhood built mirrored panels into interior courtyards, bouncing daylight through layers of walls and into kitchens. These innovations were born not from royal grants or grand design, but from avoidance, avoiding darkness, avoiding debt, avoiding the eye of the inspector. The inspectors, by now, were a weary breed. They traveled with satchels full of crumbling forms and ink-stained gloves. Many carried walking sticks not for style, but to nudge open stubborn shutters. They developed habits, squinting at reflections, counting pigeons, they nested near light, and sniffing for that faint mineral scent of damp plaster, a hint that a wall once breathed. One even trained a small dog to bark when shown light through lace curtains. Still, they could not keep up. The Bureau de Clarté, once envisioned as the pinnacle of Enlightenment rationalism, was collapsing under contradictions. Windows were constantly being added, subtracted, hidden, or revealed. Buildings changed hands. Renovations were undocumented. Deaths went unreported. Tax debts passed quietly from one inheritor to the next until no one remembered which window was which. The Crown attempted a final fix. In 1772, an ordinance was issued simplifying the whole scheme. All properties above a certain value would be assigned a flat facade tax based on frontage, not window count. But the rollout was uneven, and in many towns, both taxes were charged simultaneously. This created farcical situations where a homeowner was taxed for their wall, and then again for its eyes. Discontent simmered. By this time, the burden of sunlight had shifted almost entirely onto the poor. Wealthier families had long since found ways to avoid or absorb the fee. But for small urban households, the tax was punishing. In Lille, a single mother with 3 windows and a hand-sewn business was jailed for delinquency. In Lyon, a schoolteacher boarded up 2 windows in his classroom, forcing his pupils to write by candlelight. These were not political acts. They were practical ones, but they left scars. The great irony of the window tax was that it made people sicker. Less light meant more illness, damp homes, moldy corners, children with pale skin and bad lungs. Physicians wrote letters to ministers. A few brave souls lobbied for reform, citing increased cases of melancholia brought on by lack of natural clarity. Their petitions were filed, stamped, shelved. By the late 1780s, France was cracking. Not just the tax system, but the entire scaffold of royal finance. Bread prices soared. Nobles hoarded. Paris boiled. In 1789, the Bastille fell. The National Assembly rose. The old order trembled. The window tax died quietly. No guillotine. No mobs. Just a clause buried in a sweeping decree on feudal reform. All personal taxes not tied to land or inheritance are hereby abolished. Just like that, after nearly a century of counting pains, the inspectors vanished. The ledgers stopped. The Bureau de Clarté was shuttered. Literally, its office windows boarded up due to unpaid rent, and the country exhaled. Bricks were knocked out. Glass was returned. Shutters swung open for the first time in decades. In Rouen, a whole street tore down its false facades in a single weekend. In Toulouse, children reportedly ran through alleys shouting, "The sun is free!" "The sun is free," the architecture responded. Builders no longer held back. Windows multiplied. Light flooded into parlors, workshops, stairwells. Designs shifted. The 19th century French townhouse, tall, airy, symmetrical, was born not just from style, but from long restrained hunger for brightness. But not all traces of the tax vanished. In some buildings, the bricked windows were left in place, not out of laziness, but memory. These became known as fenêtres mortes, dead windows. They weren't repaired or removed. They were painted, outlined, respected. Some bore carvings, initials, dates, small suns. They became quiet monuments to a time when light had a price. Historians have since uncovered entire notebooks from tax collectors, filled with detailed sketches of window counts. One, dated 1765, includes a doodle of a house with wings and a sun above it, captioned, "How It Ought to Be." Today, you can still find traces of this strange chapter. In cities across France, walk the older quarters. Look up. You'll see them. Bricked eyes, mismatched frames, arches with no panes. Some are covered with vines. Others wear graffiti. Most go unnoticed, but every so often, someone stops. They stare, they wonder, and they ask the same question. We all eventually do when faced with unnecessary rules wrapped in dusty logic. Who thought this was a good idea? And deeper still, how long can people live without light before they start tearing down the walls? Imagine the Nile, wide and patient, curling its way past reed-lined banks and sun-bleached fields. The year is somewhere around 1400 BCE, deep in Egypt's 18th dynasty, and the harvest is just ending. Wheat and barley, golden and fragrant, lie stacked in heaps beneath a sky that hasn't changed in 5,000 years. And from those heaps comes Egypt's most sacred offering, not gold, not jewels, but bread. Bread was more than food to the ancient Egyptians. It was currency, prayer, medicine, and law. Tombs were filled with it, contracts written over it, gods fed with it. And somewhere between the fields of Lower Egypt and the stone ovens of temple kitchens, recipes once flourished, recipes so ordinary, so vital, that they never seemed worth writing down, until they were lost. Today, most people know ancient Egypt for its pyramids, its pharaohs, its jackal-headed gods. But hidden in its daily life was a complex, thriving bread culture, rich in variety, full of function, and central to survival. Bread began in the fields. The primary grains were emmer, a kind of ancient wheat, and hulled barley. Unlike modern wheat, emmer was tough. It had to be pounded by hand, winnowed in the wind and sifted repeatedly. Grinders used a tool called a saddle quern, a curved stone used with a smaller rubbing stone to crush the grain into flour. This work, mostly done by women, left grooves in the bones of their knees and grit in the bread itself. Yes, ancient Egyptian bread was sandy. Dental records from mummies routinely show worn molars, cracked enamel, and chronic jaw stress. Eating. A loaf meant eating a little bit of Egypt itself, but the bread wasn't just plain. In village homes and royal kitchens alike, bakers added all manner of ingredients: dates, honey, sycamore figs, spices, and herbs. Some breads were shaped like animals, crocodiles, fish, birds, to honor the gods. Others were flat, round, or even conical. There were loaves for breakfast, for funerals, for festivals, and for bribes. Bread shaped the rhythm of daily life, and the recipes? That's where the mystery begins. For all the importance of bread, very few written recipes survive. Egyptians didn't have cookbooks in the way we understand them. Instructions were passed down orally, embedded in routine, guarded by generations of women, priests, and professional bakers. Temple records mention bread offerings, some as elaborate as 27 loaves of shaped honey seed wheat bread. But the preparation methods are vague. What we do have are images. In tomb paintings, we see men mixing dough in large vats, women fanning ovens, children carrying trays. In the tomb of Ramos, a nobleman in Thebes, there's a sequence showing the full cycle: grinding, kneading, shaping, and baking in tall, narrow ovens made of clay. These ovens, called tabun, were filled with hot coals, and dough was slapped onto the inner wall to bake. Timing was done by eye, texture by touch. Bakers used no thermometers, no timers, only experience. Some loaves were leavened, others not. Here lies another puzzle. The ancient Egyptians used naturally occurring yeasts, likely wild strains from the Nile air or leftover beer mash. Brewing and baking were twin crafts, both involving fermentation, both requiring precision. In fact, some of the earliest yeast-rich breads may have begun as accidents. Beer left out too long, dough gone bubbly. Once discovered, it became a feature. Fermented doughs were mixed with new flour and shaped into small domes or crescent moons. These airy loaves were called tiae, and they held deep religious meaning. Bread was offered to Ra at dawn, to Osiris at sunset, to Anubis during embalming. Rituals. Temples had dedicated bakeries, often staffed by high-ranking women who controlled the flow of sacred grain. And the taste? Well, we can guess. Experiments by modern archaeologists using authentic emmer, recreated ovens, and yeast harvested from ancient beer jars produce bread that is dense, nutty, slightly sour, with a chewy crust and a damp center. Add honey, or dates, and the flavors deepen. Add coriander or fenugreek, and you get the spice-scented loaves likely reserved for feasts. But even the best reconstructions can't recapture the texture of routine. Because ancient Egyptian bread wasn't always fresh. Loaves were baked in batches and eaten over several days. Stale bread was soaked in beer or water. Crumbs were mixed with onions and fat to make stews. Nothing was wasted, and bread was everywhere. Laborers on the pyramids were paid in it. Soldiers carried it in sacks. Priests distributed it to the poor. Parents packed it in funerary bundles for their children, meant to feed them in the afterlife. One tomb inscription reads, "Let there be bread for my ka, fresh as the morning and soft as the sky." But with all its presence, something strange happened over time. The names survived. The rituals remained. But the methods began to fade. Over centuries, as Egypt fell under Greek, Roman, and Arab rule, baking techniques changed. Emmer gave way to softer wheat. Ovens modernized. Religious offerings shifted. And with those shifts, the old bread recipes slipped further from memory. One scholar, writing in the 19th century, noted that modern Egyptians no longer eat bread as their ancestors did, but the love for it remains. Even today, the Egyptian word for bread, aish, means life. Perhaps that's why archaeologists keep trying to bring the loaves back. In 2020, a team used yeast scraped from ancient pots found in tombs at Saqqara. After reviving the strain, they baked bread using emmer flour, Nile salt, and spring water. The result? A heavy, rich loaf with a scent like warm soil and date sugar. A flavor, they said, that tastes like history. But these reconstructions are guesses. The real recipes, the subtle tricks, the rituals of rising, the texture of kneading by moonlight, are gone. Which leads us to ask, if bread was life in ancient Egypt, what else have we forgotten with each? Vanished loaf? Bread in ancient Egypt was not merely baked. It was constructed, prepared with purpose, and arranged as carefully as a pyramid's stones. And nowhere was this more evident than in the temples. To walk into the sacred bakery of Karnak or Abydos was to step into a world where food met eternity. These weren't noisy kitchens with laughing cooks and clattering pots. These were hushed chambers, dim with incense smoke, where flour was measured like incense and loaves were shaped like prayers. Every temple had a persege, a house of loaves. Its primary function, to prepare the hundreds of ritual breads required for daily offerings to the gods. At dawn, Ra was to be greeted with hot bread and cool beer. At dusk, Osiris received the same. Bastet, goddess of the home, liked crescent loaves with coriander. Thoth, the ibis-headed keeper of wisdom, was often given oblong breads with a folded top, meant to resemble the curled scrolls of scribes. Each god had a preference, and each loaf had a meaning. The recipes were passed down through temple apprenticeships, often guarded jealously. One papyrus fragment recovered near the Temple of Edfu describes a 6-day cycle of bread offerings, including loaves soaked in lotus water, mixed with poppy seeds, and baked only on the 6th hour of light. Why? The text doesn't say. It simply ends with, "Because so it was done, and so it must be done." The loaves themselves were categorized by size, shape, and purpose. Some were for divine consumption, others for the dead, and others still for the living, priests, attendants, and beggars alike. The largest loaves, often weighing several pounds, were shaped like domed pyramids or bulls. These were funeral offerings, placed in tombs alongside jars of beer and pots of honey. And what about the secret loaves? These were baked for specific ceremonies known only to the priesthood. They included moon feast breads, eclipse offerings, and coronation loaves baked using flour ground under ritual silence. Some of these were made with water drawn from sacred wells. Others were mixed with crushed blue lotus petals, thought to inspire divine dreams. One temple in Thebes is said to have produced a bread so fragrant that it was used as perfume, placed in satchels to be carried by nobles on long journeys. No recipe survives. Just a single line from an inscription. The bread of Heru that sweetens the breath of kings. Not all sacred breads were consumed. Some were dried, lacquered, and placed in tombs as eternal sustenance. In the tomb of Khnumhotep, archaeologists found loaves nearly 4,000 years old, still intact, still shaped, still resting in their baskets, like sleeping offerings. Analysis revealed they were made from emmer, mixed with ground date pits, and formed in a tightly coiled spiral. Whether they were edible is uncertain, but their survival is astonishing. More curious still are the bread molds found in royal tombs, carved from limestone shaped like lotus flowers, suns, or ankhs. Some scholars believe these were used to shape dough before baking. Others think they were symbols, not tools, part of funerary magic, never meant for use. Outside the temples, in the bustling neighborhoods of Thebes and Memphis, baking was less ceremonial but no less vital. Urban bakeries operated much like small workshops. Ovens burned day and night. Dough was kneaded on wooden tables, sometimes with feet when hands grew tired. Apprentices shaped loaves while masters tended the ovens. Some bakers offered flavored loaves, spiced with cumin, smeared with garlic, paste, or sprinkled with roasted grains. Others specialized in simple flatbreads sold by weight, wrapped in papyrus leaves and eaten while still warm. Payment was often in kind. A farmer might trade a jar of honey for 6 loaves. A fisherman, a string of dried catfish. Bread was barter, bread was economy, and bread was political. In times of scarcity, the distribution of grain, and thus bread, became a matter of control. Pharaohs rose and fell on their ability to feed the people. Scribes recorded grain stores with obsessive precision. A bad harvest meant hunger. 2 in a row meant unrest. One official, in a letter from the time of Ramesses II, wrote, "The people have begun to speak in the marketplaces. They say, 'What good is a sun god who does not feed his fields?'" That kind of sentiment worried kings. To counter famine, the state maintained granaries, massive mud brick structures with vaulted chambers. designed to hold enough grain to last years. These were guarded by state officials and overseen by scribes who tracked deposits like sacred math. Some scribes were so specialized, they knew the yield of a field by the texture of its bread. Still, no system was perfect. Bread spoiled. Weevils multiplied. Clay ovens cracked in the heat. And through it all, the recipes persisted. Not on papyrus, but in the hands that shaped the dough, in the heat of the stones, in the rhythm of kneading. It's believed that most families had a favorite: bread, a shape, a blend, a technique passed down from grandmother to daughter to child. But these recipes weren't considered remarkable. They weren't written. They were lived until they weren't. Over time, the invasion of foreign powers, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, changed the language, the religion, and the kitchen. New grains arrived, new tools, old words faded. Ta became artos, then panis, then kubs. The flavor shifted. The oven shapes changed. The rituals were forgotten. All that remained were fragments. A carving of a woman shaping a loaf. A child's clay, toy shaped like a bun. A tomb inscription reading, "Let her eat warm bread in the West." It's easy to think of lost recipes as trivial, just meals we no longer make. But in Egypt, bread was not just food. It was identity, a world of meaning, flavor, and memory, vanished with the people who once smelled it rise. Which leaves us with one last question. If the recipes are gone, but the loaves remain, can we still taste what they meant? In the cool chambers of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, tucked between limestone canopic jars and gilded Shabti figurines, sits something far more modest: a petrified loaf of bread. It's dense, misshapen, scorched black along the edges. At first glance, it resembles a lump of rock, unremarkable, inert. But press your imagination close, and you might catch a whiff of its story. Sun-scorched fields, flour ground with stone, fingers pressing dough into form, an oven glowing at dawn. This bread, carbon dated to over 3,000 years ago, is one of the oldest surviving loaves on Earth. It may no longer be edible, but it remains a message, quiet, grainy, and enduring. And in recent years, this quiet message has grown louder. Modern researchers, bakers, and archaeobotanists have begun to reawaken ancient Egyptian bread, not just in theory, but in ovens. Some are scholars, others are hobbyists. All are drawn to the same mystery. What did it really taste like? And what would it feel like to knead the dough of a vanished world? One of the most ambitious efforts began in the labs of Cambridge University, where microbiologist Seamus Blackley, best known for helping invent the Xbox, set out to revive yeast harvested from 4,000-year-old Egyptian pots. His approach was delicate. Using sterile tools, he swabbed the interior of ancient ceramic vessels, recovered from tomb sites, pots once used for brewing or baking. From these samples, he isolated dormant yeast colonies, carefully fed them with fresh flour and water, and waited. Over several days, the colonies stirred. They bubbled. They woke up. They were alive. Blackley then mixed the yeast with emmer flour, local salt, and spring water. He shaped the dough by hand and baked it in a small clay-lined oven he had modeled after ancient Egyptian tabun ovens. The results? A rich, nutty bread, dense and aromatic, slightly sour, with a deeply golden crust. But perhaps the most striking aspect wasn't taste, it was time. The bread took hours to rise, the oven hours to heat. The preparation required full days, slow labor, and close attention. No timers, no leavening packets, just flour, fire, and patience. It was, as Blackley described, like baking with ghosts. His was not the only effort. At the University of Copenhagen, Researchers studying grain residues on ancient grindstones found high traces of barley and emmer, along with crushed legumes, herbs, and even occasional floral starches, evidence that some loaves may have been seasoned with wildflowers or crushed chickpeas. In Saqqara, excavation teams unearthed a bakery complex from the Old Kingdom, revealing communal ovens, flour bins, and charred bread fragments, some of which bore faint imprints of netting, perhaps used to shape or carry the loaves. What emerges from these findings is not just a recipe, but a rhythm. Ancient Egyptian bread was not about precision, it was about intuition. Grain by feel, dough by texture, heat judged by scent and flame color. Bakers worked without scales, thermometers, or measuring spoons. Their tools were their bodies, their ovens, extensions of their breath and sweat, and their knowledge was communal. Recipes passed by gesture, not word. A mother's twist of the wrist, a neighbor's whispered warning about sour mash, a child's first try at shaping a crescent loaf. These memories, embedded in muscle, left no scrolls, only impressions in stone, soot, and tooth enamel. Today, we can reconstruct the ingredients. Emmer wheat, crushed barley, salt from the delta, water filtered through linen. We can rebuild the ovens and harvest the yeast. But we cannot reconstruct the fingers that knew when the dough was ready. We cannot duplicate the calloused palms that pressed prayers into loaves before funerals. And so we come to the question at the heart of this story. What have we lost? We have lost more than recipes. We've lost a way of thinking about bread, not as product, but as presence, as offering, as connection between people, gods, and seasons. The ancient Egyptians did not eat bread to fill a gap. They ate to continue a tradition, to nourish their dead, to honor their deities. They broke loaves in silence before sunrise. They carried them as tokens of love, hope, and remembrance. In some tombs, tiny loaves were carved from alabaster, not to be eaten, but to signal eternity. In others, real loaves were placed beside the body, sealed in jars, meant to rise again just as the soul might. Bread, in this world, was resurrection. So when modern bakers knead dough with ancient yeast, they are doing more than reviving a flavor. They are opening a conversation across time. A few loaves have even been offered in replica rituals. In Luxor, a local temple reconstruction group baked traditional dome-shaped loaves and laid them in woven reed baskets near the Nile, reciting lines from old hymns. Let the loaves be firm, let the beer be cool, let the gods be satisfied. Tourists watched, cameras clicked, but for a few the gesture was more than performance. It was remembrance. Back in Cairo, the petrified loaf sits still. Its surface is hard, its interior long since turned to dust. But when you stand before it, you are standing before a question, one that outlived the scribe, the baker, the pharaoh, and the god. Not, how was this made? But, who touched this, and whom did they make it for? Because somewhere, in the vanished kitchens of Thebes or Memphis or Abydos, someone once stood barefoot on cool stone, dusted their hands with flour, and shaped that loaf for someone they loved, or feared, or served. And that loaf remains, hard as rock, soft with memory, just waiting for someone to imagine its warmth again. Picture the Eurasian steppe at dusk. The grass stretches endlessly, gold fading to ash in the slant of the sun. There are no trees, no cities, only the wind, the hoofbeats of a distant rider, and a small felt tent glowing faintly from within, its circular walls tethered with rawhide, its smoke hole tracing whispers into the sky. Inside, a man is asleep beside a leather saddlebag. His name is not recorded, but he is one of thousands like him, a postal worker of the Mongol Empire, a cog in the fastest communication system the medieval world had ever known. He is not a warrior, not a merchant. He carries no sword, just messages, sealed in pouches, tied in cloth, or etched into bark. He is part of the Yam. The Yam, named from the Turkic word for road or relay, was the imperial postal network founded under Genghis Khan in the early 13th century. Its goal was breathtakingly simple: move information quickly, securely, and across the entire Mongol world, from China to the Caspian, from the Siberian forests to the Persian Gulf. And it worked. At its height, the Yam included over 1,400 relay stations called urtus, spaced roughly every 25 to 30 miles across Mongol-controlled lands. Each station had fresh horses, supplies, and shelter. Riders could swap animals and continue without delay. Some messages traveled over 200 miles in a single day, a pace not matched in Europe for centuries. But such speed came at a cost: exhaustion, which brings us back to the felt tent. These mobile postal workers, known as yamchi, rode through windstorms, floods, and frost. They crossed deserts where the only sign of direction was the sun. They rode at night by starlight, and in winter by the crunch of their own frozen breath. Their tents, called jers or yurts, were their only refuge. A jer was more than a shelter. It was a transportable home designed for life in motion, built from a collapsible wooden lattice and covered in thick felt made of sheep's wool. It could be assembled in under an hour and broken down just as fast. Yam workers often used smaller variants, simple, weatherproof, circular tents they could pitch alone, even when snow began to fall. Inside the tent was sparse: a sheepskin blanket, a saddle used as a pillow, dried meat and fermented mares. Milk hung in pouches from the ceiling. A small iron brazier smoldered near the center, more smoke than heat, but enough to warm fingers numbed from rains. Despite the hardship, the Yamchi were proud. They carried orders from the Khan himself. Their tokens, small plaques called paisa, were proof of their authority. These silver or gold medallions, engraved with the imperial seal, allowed them to demand food, shelter, and fresh horses from any village, any official, any home. To refuse a paisa was treason, because the Yam system was not optional. It was vital. The Mongol Empire, so vast it was said you could ride for months without leaving its bounds, was glued together not by walls, but by messages. Commanders needed orders. Governors needed reports. Merchants needed permissions. Even marriage proposals and grain inventories crossed the steppes under wax and seal. The Yam made this possible. But it wasn't glamorous. A rider might spend 3 weeks alone between stations, surviving on dried curds and barley cakes. Wolves howled outside the tent. Snow gathered at the seams. The leather straps of his satchel grew stiff with frost. Insects plagued him in summer. Sandstorms blinded him in spring. And always, he moved forward. Every station had its quirks. Some were little more than mud huts beside river bends. Others were fortified shelters near mountain passes. The grandest, near Karakoram or Samarkand, had tiled roofs and hot meals. But most were simple: felt walls, fresh horses, a spare tent stake carved with a pattern to prove legitimacy. At each urtu, the rider would dismount, hand off the message pouch, and receive a new one. Some stayed the night. Others rode on. If a message was urgent, marked with a red tassel, riders changed horses without pause, galloping on through snow or nightfall. They followed no roads, only paths made by hoof and habit, memorized through generations. Sometimes they rode parallel to merchant caravans or army patrols. Other times, they were alone, so alone that some carried pebbles in their satchels to count the hours between heartbeats. And yet, the system endured. Historians estimate the Yam operated continuously for over a century, through the reigns of Genghis Khan, Ogedai, Monka, and Kublai. It connected a world more vast and diverse than any European state. Buddhists in China, Muslims in Persia, shamans in Siberia, Christians in Armenia, all within one communication web. The riders themselves were often locals. Some were Mongols, others were Turkic nomads, Chinese peasants or Persian converts. What united them wasn't ethnicity or language, but function. They were the bloodstream of empire. Their hearts beat between gallops. Their dreams, if they had any, were whispered. Beneath sheepskin, beside a dying ember. Some died on the road, fell to bandits, or fever, or just disappeared into storms. Their horses later found grazing near torn tents. They were rarely named in records. But when a message failed to arrive, the empire noticed. And when the system worked, the Khan smiled. Because in an age where most rulers knew only what they could see from their towers, the Mongol Khans knew what was happening hundreds of miles away, within days, faster than any pope, faster than any king, all because of riders in felt tents, sleeping beside their satchels, dreaming in silence. But as the empire aged, cracks began to show. The yam was never designed to last forever. It was a machine of urgency, built for empire at its most expansive. And like all imperial systems, its strength depended on central control, cooperation, and fear. As long as the Khans ruled with a single will, undisputed, unpredictable, and divine, the yam thrived. But power, like tents in the wind, is easily pulled from its pegs. The trouble began not with rebellion or invasion, but with inheritance. Genghis Khan's grandsons divided the empire into uluses, separate khanates that operated semi-independently. The Yuan in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. At first, communication between them held. Messages still crossed the steppes. Horses still thundered down the relay roads. But each region had its own concerns, its own enemies, its own taxes. And the yam? It became a question. Who would fund it? Who would feed the horses? Who would punish a village that refused to host a postal rider? Answers became slow. Riders were turned away. Stations were shuttered. Horses fell ill or went unshod. The paisa, once a badge of power, began to lose its edge. In the Golden Horde, some villages started charging yam riders for meals. In Persia, relay stations near the mountains were abandoned after a local uprising made passage unsafe. The system frayed. A letter that once took 4 days now took 7. A message between Karakorum and Baghdad, once reliable within a week, began to miss its mark entirely. In some places, bandits disguised themselves as yam officials, carrying fake tokens and stealing from isolated relay huts. And yet, riders still rode. Not because they were ordered, but because the habit endured. Some old Yamchi refused to quit. They patched their tents with scrap felt, rode half-lame horses, and handed off messages like offerings to a fading god. Their lives were tied to the saddle. Without it, they were just ghosts of empire. One rider, whose log survives only in Persian, translation, wrote, "There is no more watch at the river bend. The trees remember me, but not the men. Even in its decline, the yam left marks." Merchants had adopted the routes. Towns sprang up around old relay stations. Some roads were paved, some tents turned into brick huts. The idea of long-distance communication had taken root. In China, the Yuan dynasty began issuing standardized permits to travelers, modeled on the Mongol paisa. In Persia, scholars praised the old yam as a time when the pen outran the sword. But there were bitter notes, too. In the Yuan court, officials complained of false riders exploiting the system. In Russia, Orthodox clerics denounced the yam as a tool of occupation, its network of messengers seen as tendrils of Mongol control. And in parts of Central Asia, entire valleys, once echoing with hoofbeats, fell quiet. the old routes buried beneath sand and snow. Still, fragments remained. Archaeologists have uncovered the charred remains of a station near the Amu Darya, a clay oven, broken stirrups, bits of leather. In Inner Mongolia, faint ruts in the soil still trace the path of long-gone relay roads. In museum drawers, faded paisa tokens sit beside coins and seals, once passports, now curiosities. And then there are the stories. In Western Mongolia, some herding families still pass down tales of great riders who crossed the land faster than the wind, who never stopped for storms or wolves or sleep. Old men in felt coats speak of great-grandfathers who carried messages for the Khan, whose bones were buried along the old Yam roads, marked only by stacked stones and silence. But perhaps the most telling legacy of the Yam lies not in what it achieved, but in what it failed to prevent: the empire's fragmentation. For all its speed, for all its brilliance, the Yam could not hold a world together once the voices within it began to speak in different tongues. By the mid-14th century, the Yam had shrunk to pieces. Some routes remained active within local khanates, but the grand vision of one vast, buzzing network was gone. The roads were still there, but the urgency was not. The wind still blew, but no one followed its call. Still, the felt tents remained, passed down, repurposed, some used by shepherds, others by merchants. They no longer carried messages from emperors, but their seams still remembered the weight of them. A few ended up as dwellings for orphaned children, others as shelters for passing monks. One, according to oral tradition, was used for a wedding, the only time in memory that its flap was opened not for duty, but for joy. And in that image, a tent once used to carry the word of rulers, now warmed by laughter, we see something essential. The Yam was not just a postal system. It was a dream of connection, of reaching across vast emptiness with trust and urgency, of believing that what mattered in one place might matter in another, that a message, if carried faithfully, might change something far away. That dream didn't die. It changed form. When the Mongol Empire crumbled, others took the idea forward. The Persian courier systems, the Ottoman ulak, the Russian yamshchik, even the Pony Express in America centuries later owed something to the felt tents on the steppe. All were shadows of that first, wild ride across silence. So the next time you see a letter in your mailbox or watch a message fly across the screen, in a second, pause. And remember a man in a round felt tent, somewhere beneath the cold stars, curled beside a saddlebag, trusting that the road ahead would still be there in the morning. The final echoes of the Yam may have faded from imperial maps, but the road, both literal and imagined, never truly ended. Even in its absence, the Mongol postal system remained a blueprint, etched into the soil of the continent. Long after the empire splintered, travelers still followed the worn grooves left by galloping hooves. Merchants rode the same dusty trails. Shepherds pitched tents beside the sunken posts of old relay huts. Memory outlived empire. In the 15th century, a Persian ambassador named Ghiyath al-Din traveled to China by caravan and recorded that along the route, villagers still pointed out the ruins of Khan's houses, what locals believed to be former postal stations. Though overgrown, many retained their circular footprints. Stones formed in half-moons marked where yurts once stood. Sometimes, bits of rusted tack or horseshoe nails were pulled from the dirt like relics. A few elders remembered the riders. They described them with reverence. Men who rode without fear, men who asked for no bed, only boiled milk and firewood, men who came and left like wind. In Mongolia itself, the Urtus were never truly erased. Some continued to function as stopping points for travelers and herdsmen. A few evolved into villages. One, near the Khenti Mountains, still goes by a name that translates loosely to the station where the moon stopped. a poetic reference to a rider forced to wait until nightfall passed. By the 1600s, the idea of the yam had taken on a mythic quality. Writers in Safavid Persia and Ming China referenced the system with awe, both for its reach and its ambition. It became a shorthand for discipline, speed, and imperial will. Even its failures were admired. "Better a road once ruled," wrote one Chinese scholar, "than many roads forever arguing." European travelers, too, were fascinated. Marco Polo, whose travels brought him through the Mongol court, wrote extensively about the yam, the efficiency of the stations, the swiftness of the riders, and the strict penalties for tampering with their messages. He likened the network to veins in a body, carrying the lifeblood of empire. But Polo missed the soul of it. He wrote as an outsider. To the Yamchi themselves, the network was more than logistics. It was identity. A rider wasn't just delivering news. He was performing a ritual. Each handoff, each gallop, each night spent alone under felt. These were acts of service not just to the Khan, but to a vision of connectedness in a fragmented world. Some riders passed the trade to their sons. Others taught apprentices how to read the wind, how to care for hooves, how to brew tea from dry steppe herbs. A few scratched poems into the beams of station huts, fragments that, when translated, hint at longing, at endurance, at quiet pride. This horse knows the road. I know the silence. The sky does not speak, but it remembers me. By the 18th century, newer systems had taken hold. Russian czars built their own postal roads, using some of the same routes. The Ottomans organized their ulak messengers. China developed imperial courier networks with printed permits and waterway routes. But the essence of the yam, a decentralized, high-trust, high-speed system relying on individual riders and simple, robust infrastructure, was never bettered, just replaced. And yet, in some ways, it never truly left. During the 20th century, Soviet ethnographers studying Mongolian steppe life interviewed elderly herders who still described distances in riders' days, how far a Yamchi might travel, in one dawn-to-dusk stretch. A few still used knots in leather belts to count days between stations. In one family, a rusted paisa plaque was kept in a box, polished each new year, though no one remembered quite why. Even now, in modern Mongolia, the road culture endures. Motorbikes now replace horses. Plastic tarps flap beside felt tents. Phones ring where messages once galloped. But the spirit of movement, of information carried across vast, unmarked places, persists. Drivers still stop for tea in remote yurts. Travelers still trust the kindness of strangers. And somewhere, beneath the hum of modern engines, the hoofbeat rhythm lingers, because the yam was never just about speed. It was about reliability. A world without wires, maps, or formal addresses, the Mongols built a system that promised a message could cross mountains, rivers, deserts, and arrive. That promise, once fulfilled, became memory. And memory became story. A story told not with ink, but with hooves. Not on scrolls, but on wind. Not by historians, but by the tents that still dot the steppes, the trails that still press down the grass, and the people who, without quite knowing it, still ride paths carved by riders long gone. It's tempting to ask what it all meant. What was the value of a system that no longer exists? What's the point of remembering a network built by empire and erased by time? But perhaps that's the wrong question. Perhaps the yam wasn't just a system, but a gesture. A vast, tireless, dust-covered affirmation that even the loneliest corners of the world were part of something larger. A letter written in Karakorum mattered in Baghdad. A grain count in Samarkand mattered in Beijing. A whisper from a tent in the Altai could reach the ears of a Khan 3 weeks later, thousands of miles away. And maybe that's all it ever was. A way to say, you are not alone. We are connected. The message will arrive. Somewhere, a felt tent waits. A horse stamps its hoof, and the rider sleeps just for a while before taking the road again.